Welcome to another Reddit horror story, everyone. Tonight, I have something truly unsettling to share, straight from the depths of Reddit. So, get comfortable, dim the lights, and brace yourself for a journey into fear. This happened to me. As we piled into the car, my friends joked and laughed, trying to keep the mood light. The engine hummed as we drove out of town and onto the narrow, winding road that led to the manor. The trees seemed to stretch higher and higher as the road got darker, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes, casting long, eerie shadows across the headlights. It was like the forest itself was alive, watching us as we ventured deeper into the heart of it. The further we drove, the more unsettling the silence around us became. There were no sounds of animals, no wind rustling through the leaves, just the soft hum of the tires on the pavement and the occasional creak of the car's suspension. My friends were in high spirits, talking about what they thought we might encounter inside the manor. Some were joking about ghosts, others speculated we might find hidden treasure. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling growing in the pit of my stomach. Sure, I'd heard the stories, the ones about the eerie moans in the night, the faces seen in the windows. But what if those stories were true? What if something truly horrible had happened inside that house, and it was still there, lingering, waiting? We finally arrived at the gates, and my heart skipped a beat. The old wrought iron entrance was partially rusted, the bars twisted in places like they had been bent by some unearthly force. There was no car, no sign of life, nothing except the oppressive silence. I could see the house in the distance, dark and foreboding against the backdrop of the darkening sky. A chill ran down my spine. The place was even worse than I had imagined. The stories made it sound like an old, abandoned building, but seeing it in person was something else entirely. The moment I stepped out of the car, I felt a heavy weight in the air. It was thick with the stench of decay, as if the very earth around the house had absorbed the evil that had once lived there. My friends were still joking, unaware of the dread that was settling over me. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that we were being watched. Every instinct in me told me to turn around and leave, but I refused to be the one to back out. Not tonight. We walked through the gates and up the path leading to the house. The garden was overgrown, with vines crawling up the walls and creeping into the windows. It was as if nature was trying to reclaim the land. The windows of the manor were dark, empty eyes staring out at us, and I couldn't help but imagine that something, or someone, might be watching from inside. I shook the thought away, trying to focus on the present. But it lingered. As we reached the front door, one of my friends, Ryan, dared me to knock. I hesitated, but the challenge was clear. I couldn't let them think I was afraid. With a deep breath, I stepped forward and knocked loudly on the door. The sound echoed in the night, too loud, too hollow. There was no response, just the wind rustling through the trees and the sound of my heart thudding in my chest. We waited a moment, but nothing happened. The door was old, creaky, and slightly ajar. After a long pause, I slowly pushed it open. It groaned, as if it hadn't been moved in years. The inside of the house was worse than I could have imagined. The air was thick with dust, and the walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the remnants of what had once been a beautiful home. Old furniture was strewn about haphazardly, covered in sheets that had yellowed with time. The floors creaked under our feet, the wood warped and splintered, as if the house was alive, breathing with us. We walked further in, our flashlights dancing across the walls, illuminating faded paintings and long-forgotten trinkets. There was a strange feeling in the air, like we were trespassing in a place that didn't want to be disturbed. My friends were whispering excitedly, exploring the rooms, but I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Then we heard it. A soft sound, like the creaking of old wood. But it was followed by something else, something that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural growl. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, the sound of the wind moving through the cracks. But then it came again, louder this time, like something was trying to get our attention. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Ryan, who was closest to me. He looked up from the old family portraits on the wall, his face pale. "Yeah," he replied, his voice shaky. "What was that?" Before anyone could answer, the sound came again. It was closer this time. My heart raced, and I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest. I glanced around, but there was nothing but the oppressive silence of the house, thick with dust and decay. "We need to leave," I muttered, but I didn't want to sound weak. I couldn't. Not in front of my friends. But they were too busy. Ryan was fiddling with a dusty old lamp. Sam was exploring the kitchen, and Lauren was in another room, her flashlight scanning over the walls. I felt increasingly alone in this strange, cold place. The growl had stopped, but the unease in my chest only deepened. We moved to the dining room, the room where the husband had been found all those years ago. The room was massive, with a large chandelier hanging overhead, its crystals long since shattered. The dining table was still there, though covered in dust and cobwebs. As we stepped into the room, I noticed something strange, something that hadn't been there before. A fresh stain on the floor. It was dark, like blood, and it spread outwards in a pool, as if something or someone had been dragged across the floor. I froze. "Guys, look at this," I called out, pointing at the stain. My friends gathered around me, all of them silent now, looking down at the dark splotch. "That's weird," Ryan muttered, crouching down to get a closer look. "It's fresh. How is that possible?" Before anyone could say anything more, a loud bang echoed through the house. The door slammed shut behind us, sending us all jumping in shock. The sound of it reverberated through the manor, as if it was trying to lock us in. "Okay, I'm done," Lauren said, her voice trembling. "This is too much. Let's get out of here." But it wasn't that easy. We tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if it had been sealed shut, trapped by something unseen. Panic set in as we all began to pull and push on the door, but it refused to move. We were locked in, trapped in a house that seemed to have come alive, its walls closing in around us. Then the growl came again, this time louder, more distinct. It wasn't just the house settling, it was something else, something that didn't belong here. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light. It was tall, gaunt, its features distorted by the shadows. My heart stopped. This was no ghost. This was something far worse. "Get away from it," I whispered, but no one heard me. We were too frozen in place, too afraid to move. The figure took a step toward us, and that's when I saw it clearly. It was covered in blood, fresh blood, and its eyes were wild, crazed. It was like it had been waiting for us, watching, lurking in the dark corners of the manor. I could feel its gaze on me, and my breath hitched in my throat. We bolted for the back door, the growl echoing in our ears as we ran. I don't know how we made it out, but somehow we did. The door flung open, and we scrambled out into the cold night air. We didn't stop running until we were back at the car, our hearts pounding in our chests. We never spoke of that night again. I never went back to the manor, and neither did my friends. It stood there, alone and silent, as if it had been waiting for us, but it would never claim us. Not that night. Not ever again. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I hear the growl. And sometimes, I wonder if the manor is still watching, waiting for someone else to come. We piled into my friend's car and began our drive to the manor. The road was barely visible, snaking through dense trees and thick underbrush. And the further we drove, the more isolated it felt. The air had a dampness to it, as if the forest itself had claimed this forgotten road, swallowing it whole. The house had been abandoned for years, and only a few people ever bothered to venture this far out. Even then, they didn't stay long. The foliage had grown thick, almost reclaiming the path entirely. At one point, we had to move a small dead tree out of the way just to continue. Does this place even have a name? Mark, the most eager of the group, asked from the passenger seat. He had a knack for breaking the tension, even in the most unsettling situations. I shrugged, my eyes scanning the darkening landscape. Some people call it the Forsaken Manor. Others just call it the Haunted House. Guess it depends on who you ask. Everyone laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. The car bumped along the rough terrain, and I couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of unease. The road had become so narrow that it felt like we were driving into the jaws of the forest, like the trees themselves were closing in around us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we reached the house. At first glance, it wasn't much to look at. But the closer we got, the more unsettling it became. The manor loomed in the distance, its once majestic structure now a decaying shell of its former self. The windows were all smashed in, shards of glass glinting in the fading light, as if the house had been staring out at us with vacant eyes. The facade, which might have once been grand, was now peeling away in large, uneven chunks. In places, thick green mold crept up from the base of the house, claiming what was left of the paint. I stood there, hesitant, staring up at it. The roof was still intact, but sections of it had sagged under the weight of years of neglect. The entire place was in a state of ruin, its air of desolation making it look like something out of a nightmare. "Is this it?" Mark asked, his voice wavering slightly as he looked at the crumbling structure. I nodded, a shiver running down my spine. "Yeah, this is the place." I didn't want to go inside. Not because I was afraid of ghosts, but because the house looked so filthy, so dangerous. The idea of stepping foot inside made my skin crawl. Every inch of the place seemed to be covered in years of grime and decay. The floors looked unstable, the walls were crumbling, and I could already imagine the smell that would hit us once we stepped over the threshold. But of course, my friends were all eager to explore. Mark, always the adventurer, was already unbuckling his seatbelt and grabbing his flashlight. "Come on, it'll be fun. It's not like anything's gonna happen," he urged, a playful grin plastered on his face. Reluctantly, I followed him, trying to suppress the nagging voice in my head that told me to turn around and leave while we still could. As we approached the front door, I noticed it was slightly ajar, as if inviting us in. I paused for a moment, looking back at the overgrown path we had come down. The wind whispered through the trees behind us, carrying the scent of the ocean, mixed with something else. Something foul. When we crossed the threshold, the air inside was thick and musty, like the house hadn't seen fresh air in decades. Dust danced in the beams of our flashlights as we stepped inside. Broken furniture was scattered about, remnants of lives once lived, but now forgotten. There was an eerie stillness to the place, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for us to disturb its slumber. "Ugh," Sarah muttered, wrinkling her nose. "This place smells like a dead animal." "It's just old," Mark said, brushing past her. "That's all." I didn't say anything. The house seemed to whisper to me, its creaks and groans sending shivers down my spine. The thought of exploring it was starting to feel like a bad idea, but my friends were too excited to notice. We explored the ground floor for a while, poking through rooms that were stripped bare of anything useful or valuable. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, and the floorboards creaked ominously beneath our feet. It was exactly what you would expect from a house like this, dusty, decaying, and abandoned. But then something changed. In the kitchen, Mark discovered a small annexing room, almost hidden behind a long, overgrown curtain of vines that had grown through the cracks in the wall. He called us over, his voice low with excitement. "Hey, come check this out," he said, his flashlight beam dancing over the door. It was an old wooden door, large and wide, but covered in layers of dirt and grime. When we opened it, we found a small alcove, barely enough room for one person to crawl through. At the far end, barely visible beneath the dust and cobwebs, was a trapdoor. "Is that?" I started, but trailed off as I walked closer. The door was weathered, the wood faded and cracked. The hinges were rusted, and the edges were thick with dirt. My heart began to race. "Should we open it?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air like a dare. Of course, we tried. We pulled and tugged at the trapdoor, but it wouldn't budge. It seemed stuck, like it hadn't been opened in years. We tried pushing it, even looked for a lock, but there was nothing. I could feel the excitement of my friends building as they gathered around. "I think it's stuck because of the moisture," Mark said, wiping sweat from his brow. "We should push harder." We all pushed together, and then there was a soft click. The door shifted just enough for us to see a faint glint of light from the hatch. "Got it," Mark yelled, grinning. He stepped forward and grabbed the handle, which had been painted over with layers of dust and grime. With a little more effort, the hatch creaked open. The smell hit us like a wall. It was foul, rotten, rancid, like something had been decaying down there for years. I gagged, my stomach lurching, but my friends were too excited to care. They scrambled to climb inside, eager to see what lay beneath. The stairs leading down were narrow, steep, and covered in dust. The air grew colder as we descended, the temperature dropping with each step. The walls of the narrow passage seemed to close in around us, and the smell grew worse the deeper we went. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, my pulse quickening as we reached the bottom. The room we entered was dimly lit, and the air was thick with moisture. There were shelves along the walls, cluttered with broken glass and rusted metal objects. But what caught my attention was the strange, old chair in the center of the room. It looked like something out of a horror movie, its wooden frame warped and covered in dust. And beside it was a small table, scattered with what looked like old photographs. I stepped closer to the table, my curiosity getting the better of me. I picked up one of the photos, the edges yellowed and curled. It showed a woman standing in front of the manor, a faint smile on her face. But her eyes, they were hollow, empty. I dropped the photo quickly, the chill of the room seeping deeper into my bones. "Dude, what is this place?" I whispered. Before anyone could answer, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, relieved for the distraction. The message read, "Dude, come check this out. I think we found something." I looked up at my friends. Mark was already walking toward the back of the room, his flashlight sweeping the walls. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "What is it?" I asked, my voice shaky. Mark didn't say anything at first. He just pointed down at the floor, his hand trembling. I followed his gaze. At first, I thought it was just a stain on the floor until I saw the dark, thick smudge that covered the ground. My stomach turned as I realized what it was. "Is that blood?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. I knelt down, my breath caught in my throat. The stain was dark and deep, spreading out from a crack in the floorboard. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't just some old stain. This isn't good, I muttered, standing up quickly. Mark backed away from it, his face pale as a sheet. We need to get out of here. But before we could leave, a noise echoed from somewhere deep within the house. It was soft at first, like a faint creaking sound. Then it grew louder and louder, until it sounded like something was moving in the walls. Something following us. Did you hear that? Sarah asked, her eyes wide with terror. I nodded, my heart racing. My phone buzzed again, and I took it out, only to see the same chilling message. Come check this out. I think we found something. I didn't have time to react. The lights flickered. The temperature dropped. And as I turned around, I could see it. Something watching us. Something old. Something evil. We weren't alone. Thank you so much for tuning in to tonight's chilling tale. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and share your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, stay safe, stay aware, and don't let the shadows catch you. Because once you feel their eyes on you, you might never be the same again.